Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and apologies I'm giving my talk in English, but I think your English is going to be much better than my Polish. But I did have some help listening to the debate, and hopefully I'll tell you a few things that have happened to the UK over the last few years. So I'm from an organisation called the National Institute for Health Research, equivalent of the NIH in the States, smaller, but the main funder of health research in the UK. And last week I was sitting in a conference like this, about 700 people in Westminster in London, opened by our Secretary of State for Health and with our Health Minister, celebrating 10 years of the National Institute for Health Research. So we've been on a journey that's taken 10 years to get to where we are now. We've still got a lot to do, but hopefully I'll tell you about some of the things that we've done that you maybe have already experienced barriers and problems and got solutions, or they may be problems that you're experiencing now. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we've structured the UK system to start to deal with these issues. So, why is the UK government committed to research in the National Health Service? And it is committed to research in the National Health Service. The funding it puts into research has gone up year on year. And at the last comprehensive spending review, at the end of last year, as you know, all across Europe we're in times of austerity. And many government budgets across our government went down and were cut. One of the few budgets that was increased was our health research budget. And what I'm going to try and demonstrate to you is some of the reasons why that's happened, what we've put in place, and why that's led to the impact that the government sees it's important to invest in health research. So very simply, we can improve outcomes, health outcomes, through advances in research. We can improve the quality of care. And in the debate earlier, it was discussion about do patients benefit from being in clinical trials? Well, they can do, but what the strong evidence is if a hospital or a university, a medical institution is involved in a research, their patients have better outcomes across the board. So if a hospital is research active, the patients have better outcomes in that hospital. It drives economic growth through investment by the life sciences industry and also stimulating jobs, keeping the population healthy and in work. And one of the big pieces of work we've done over the last 2 years is to look at the economic benefit of doing health research in our National Health Service. And it strengthens our international competitive position in science, both competitive within Europe and competitive globally. I think as Europe, we compete with the Far East and with the US on clinical trials, and within Europe, we compete with each other. And ultimately, it's about increasing the health and the wealth of the nation. So the National Institute's Research for Health Research's founding principles were both improving health and increasing wealth. So how did we do it? Well, at the beginning of the process in 2005, we were at a situation where the number of clinical trials in the UK was falling. Hospitals didn't want to be involved in clinical research. It was difficult to get clinical research off the ground. It was expensive, it was slow, and it was bureaucratic. We actually done a very similar thing to what you're doing in Poland and looked at what were the barriers to clinical research and what needed to change. And that was a consultation process in 2005 to a very broad range of stakeholders: clinicians, researchers, patients, the life sciences industry, government. And actually that took about 8 months, that consultation, and it changed significantly what happened and what was actually proposed. And what we eventually ended up with was a strategy for health research for 5 to 10 years. And this was called Best Research for Best Health. Interestingly, it wasn't a health department strategy. Our Secretary of State for Health took it through the government cabinet, and it was signed off by every minister in the cabinet, which meant it was a government policy, and it meant every department had to consider how they were going to support the delivery of this strategy. And that was a very important move to make sure it was a government policy rather than purely a health department policy. And interestingly, that was 3 different governments ago. that strategy has remained the same and has been strengthened across 3 separate governments of different political persuasions. So it's obviously a strong, consulted strategy that's actually endured. So, what were the challenges in 2005? Well, we have patients treated in a national health service, 60 million patients treated in one single system, free at the point of access. And that's surrounded by the knowledge economy of our universities. So we had a number of problems in the NHS. So R&D funding was allocated on a purely historical basis. Some of the big teaching hospitals got a lot of money, and some of the smaller hospitals who'd liked to be involved in research didn't get any. NHS managers and chief executives of NHS organisations didn't want to do research. For them, it was a risk and a distraction for their staff. Their job was to deliver clinical services, and research could be seen as a distraction and a risk. And there were very few incentives to do research in the NHS. There was a whole issue of problems around training and career development for clinical academics within the system. And there was no clear process to train and retain staff in the clinical research process. And also, there was a perception that research in our National Health Service, applied health research, was second class. It's not the best, most innovative research. And changing this perception of why applied health research to answer some of the key questions that's addressing that our population needs was incredibly important. So what did we do? Well, we put patients and the public at the center of this system. They are key to delivering and supporting health research in the UK. And they're at the center of the NHS and the university system. So, and it's about partnership. It was very much about partnership, how we did this. It was partnership between governments, charities, and the life sciences industry. It was partnership between our National Health Service and our universities. And what we actually do is when we put money into the system to support research, it goes to a partnership between a hospital and its local university. So it's that university-hospital partnership that actually receives the funding. And that's incredibly important incentive to make everyone take part in research. It was partnership between those leaders of research and those people who facilitate research. Research nurses, data managers, statisticians, the whole team that's required to lead research, not just the principal investigator. And it was about partnership between different research disciplines. So that might be clinical researchers, as I say, it might be statisticians, all of the research disciplines that are needed to drive the research process. And obviously, most importantly, it was partnership between researchers and patients. So what we were looking at was a health research system, putting together a health research system. And this is what we ended up with. So, as I said, we've got patients and public at the center, surrounded, treated in NHS hospitals, surrounded by the knowledge economy of universities. And we divided the system into 4 main areas. At the top, what we call the faculty, was all about training. That was about encouraging researchers to learn, to stay in the system. And we fund training right from junior PhDs right up to professor level and support them to actually be expert research clinicians. And it's about creating the research leaders of the future. We fund research programs and projects. Around a third of the budget that we spend goes on to research programs. And what I should say is that the overall investment for this whole system is around £1 billion UK pounds a year at the moment. So that's a significant investment. It's about 1% of our health budget. So £1 billion, around a third of that goes into research programs and projects. So you may have heard of our world-famous health technology assessment program, which looks at the clinical and the cost-effectiveness of new treatments. And it's what our NICE, our National Institute for Clinical and Health Excellence, bases a lot of its decisions on about recommending whether a treatment should be used by the NHS. But also we fund a lot of applied health research. Not always interventional, some observational, and not always about drugs or other therapies. Sometimes they are around psychological therapies, things like that, but a whole broad range of research that we support. We put investment into systems, and there was a lot of the debate this morning about systems and reducing bureaucracy. I'll come on later into my presentation about ethics and approvals for research and how we try to cut down the time that takes. And then finally, a large chunk of the budget, around £600 million a year, goes into what we call infrastructure. And that's the things the NHS needs to do high-quality research. It's mostly people, it's facilities, it's buildings, and it's technology platforms such as imaging equipment, etc., that are all that are needed by the health service to do high-quality clinical research. And that has an investment of around £600 million a year. So where does the NIHR sit in the innovation pathway? So at the left-hand end of the screen, you'll see we're talking about innovation, discovery science. That's where our Medical Research Council and our charity sector, very strong charity sector in the UK, specialise and focus their funding. At the right-hand end of the slide, you'll see it's about adoption and diffusion of new technologies and new treatments. And that's where our NHS commissioning and our NHS providers of services actually come into play to make sure new and effective and cost-effective treatments are spread across the NHS. Where the National Institute for Health Research sits is in the space where we're looking at evaluation and development. And what our Chief Medical Officer, who heads all of this, would like to say is the business that we're in is market failure. We fund and support research that wouldn't normally be done, incredibly important questions that would not be asked by the life sciences industry because it's not in their interest to do it. But it's incredibly important questions for both good and cost-effective new treatments and healthcare. And all of this leads to better quality and better value, and again, health and wealth that's written through everything that we do. So I'll give you one quick example of impact. You may have heard of the CRASH-2 study that was funded and initiated in the UK, but spread all over the world. This was looking at a new treatment, off-label use of an already licensed drug, tranexamic acid, in traumatic brain injury. And it was to stop bleeding in traumatic brain injury. And the study looked at whether if a dose of this compound was given within 3 hours of the traumatic injury, it could reduce the death and effects of intracranial bleeding. And the impact is this has now been adopted by the British Armed Forces. It's used in 75% of UK trauma patients and used in well over 1 million patients worldwide. And it showed that death due to bleeding was dramatically reduced with the use of this compound. And the economic benefit of that was that the cost of $64 per life saved could be attributed. An incremental cost of $64 per life saved could be attributed to using the results of this study. So you can see impact both nationally and internationally of the research that can be carried out. So the health research system that I talked about, I'm going to focus a little bit more now on what we call infrastructure. And again, I said this is mostly people, but buildings, research centres, and technology platforms. And I'm going to talk about infrastructure in 2 areas of clinical research: early phase translational medicine, experimental medicine, and later phase clinical trials. And I'll say a little bit about what we've done in each of those areas to make the UK both being able to deliver clinical research, but also to be internationally competitive and an attractive destination for research. So, if you expand that innovation pathway, each of these boxes on this screen, and I won't go into detail of all of them, are different types of investment that we've made in research groupings or centres or types of infrastructure that we've embedded in universities and hospitals across the country to deliver high-quality clinical research. At the innovation end of the spectrum, we fund what are called biomedical research centres and units, experts in translation, gone through international peer review to be the best of the best in the UK, and they get large amounts of funding to be able to deliver high-quality translational research, both academic-led and in collaboration with industry and commercial contract research with industry. We have centres that focus specifically on medical technologies, on diagnostic technologies, in vitro diagnostics. We have a clinical research network for later phase clinical trials, which I'll say a little bit more about. And at the end of the spectrum, we have centres that look at how you take the findings of research and spread them across the health service. And they do research and implementation to spread those findings across the health service. So, you don't need to read this, but it's just to demonstrate that this also has national coverage. So it means that anyone in a university or a hospital can be part of the system. Every NHS organisation in the country is part of that system and can participate in research, which means their researchers can participate in research, but also, importantly, the patients that are treated there can participate in research. So, focusing on translational research. The National Institute for Health Research has transformed the landscape by investing in biomedical research facilities and also collaborations, which I'll say a little bit more about, that can drive innovation in key areas. So, I mentioned biomedical research centres and units. These are at some of our key centres and teaching hospitals across the UK, but also at some of our smaller hospitals. The centres on the left-hand side of the screen are slightly larger, typically 100 to 150 staff, and a budget of around 100, 150 million over 5 years. The units are slightly smaller and focus on a specific area of disease and clinical need. The centres focus on a range of areas of disease and clinical need. And their job is to actually have a program of work that's focusing on translation of innovation from the laboratory and pulling it into the clinical setting, and using the cohorts of patients that they have to test those innovations in highly defined patient groups. All of these centres are busy at the moment writing their applications for the next 5 years. There's £800 million on the table for them for the next 5 years, and by the end of this year, there'll be a new designation of centres based on excellence and their ability to deliver translational research in highly innovative areas over the next 5 years. Just to give you an example of their success, and I haven't got numbers of trials, but on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see in the dark blue bars the investment. So, the other thing we wanted to do is make it easier for the life sciences industry to work with centres in the UK. Life sciences industry find it very easy to work with a key opinion leader and to go to one centre. That key opinion leader may not be the best person to deliver patients into that study, but it's important for that company to work with that investigator. It's very difficult when you start to work with multiple centres because you have to go through multiple negotiations and multiple contracts. And about 4 years ago, we set up what were called national NIHR Translational Research Partnerships. And these were specifically to work with industry on the early and exploratory development of new therapeutics. And we asked industry what they wanted, and they said the area they wanted to work in was inflammatory biology, and particularly in respiratory medicine and in joint and related inflammatory medicine, such as rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, etc. And we set up these partnerships, and they're a partnership of 18 universities and 26 individual hospitals, which on the base of it sounds like a nightmare to try and work with. But each of those organizations have signed an agreement to work together. So if a company wants to work with all of them, they can work with them as if they're working with one organization. And an example of that is if a new company wants to work with those partnerships and wants to put a confidentiality agreement in place, each center has to sign that confidentiality agreement. But it takes less than 2 weeks to do it because of the agreement to work together. So it's a very rapid way of working together across a wide range of centres in early translational research. And they've now built a strong portfolio over 4 years of research. And studies that are being done in the translational research partnerships, companies are coming to the UK to do studies that they couldn't do anywhere else in the world because of this collaborative approach. Similarly, we have something called translational research collaborations. Now, these both work with the life sciences industry and academic studies, and they're in areas of unmet clinical need, particularly in areas that are important to our government, that are high government policy. And two of those areas are dementia and rare diseases. And I'll just give you an example of the rare diseases translational research collaboration. It's based on the fact that to do good rare diseases research, you need well-characterized cohorts of patients. And being rare, those diseases, those patients are spread across the country. So what the collaboration was able to do was to bring together a national effort to deeply phenotype cohorts of patients in rare diseases that could be useful for both academic research and for life sciences industry research. And innovatively, the National Institute for Health Research put funding into the system that industry could apply for to work in collaboration with academia to look at how these deeply phenotyped cohorts could be used to support rare diseases research. And recently, one of the first studies to go through the system was with the pharmaceutical company Roche, which was looking at a compound that they have already on the market, but was repurposed for the rare disease pulmonary arterial hypertension, which has no current treatment, but is now under test for this particular treatment, and very innovative. And Roche said they would not have been able to do this anywhere else in the world. So the office I'm from is the National NIHR Office for Clinical Research Infrastructure, or NOCRI. We were set up to be a front door for both charities, research partners, and the life sciences industry. What I showed you was a complex system. You need a hand to guide you through the system. So we were set up, a small team, 14 of us. We are the satellite navigation system for those who want to work with that system. We'll take your hand and we'll introduce you to the right part of the system. And it was incredibly important to set up this office to make sure that the access point was easy. And now I'm going to move on to very briefly onto the later phase clinical trials. And we provide the infrastructure in the NHS that delivers high quality clinical trials. And by infrastructure here, I mean mostly people. So it's around 8,000 staff that we directly support within the health service to deliver clinical research. Mostly research nurses, study managers, statisticians, data managers, etc. We have national coverage. All NHS organisations are part of the clinical research network. It's based around 15 local networks across the country, and they're research-active clinicians that have expertise in 30 therapeutic areas that covers all of the therapeutic areas that you would want to research. And they've got a detailed understanding of not only the disease, but the care pathway as well. And there can be flexible deployment of resources. So research nurses can be flexibly deployed around the country to ensure that clinical trials are delivered effectively and on time. And what it means is that hospitals that are not used to doing research or not used to working with industry can be supported to be active in those studies, and therefore their patients can be involved in those studies. And we reach across the whole country. So I'm talking about England at the moment, because in the UK, you may know, we have a devolved country and a devolved healthcare system, but we reach across the whole country to make sure it's a joined-up system. And the Clinical Research Network offers a whole range of services. I think it's interesting to note, at the left-hand side of the screen, we call what's the feasibility service. And this is particularly directed at the life sciences industry. And it has three main areas. The first is early feedback on a protocol. So a company or a CRO can come to the network with an early protocol and say, would this work in the UK? Would we be able to recruit patients in the UK? And you can talk to experts within the NIHR to say, are there any changes or tweaks needed to that protocol? We then can work together with the sponsor or the CRO to look at shared site intelligence. So a sponsor or a CRO will know which researchers have delivered for them. We have a countrywide view of what those researchers are doing and what competing studies are involved. So if we bring that data together, it's a really powerful picture. And then we look at individual site intelligence. So how many patients can this site? So not the finger in the air, but actually how many patients can be delivered at this site. Because cost is an issue, but actually when we got down to the barriers, it wasn't cost, it was cost effectiveness. So companies, life science industry, do not mind paying for studies if they deliver. It's studies and sites that don't deliver that are most expensive. And what I should say is all of these feasibility services are not charged for. It's the gift of the UK government to the life sciences industry to say, come and use these services and we will not charge you. The only time we start to actually have a cost is when a contract is signed to deliver the research. And some of the debate earlier was about the time taken for contracting and costing. The Clinical Research Network has a range of commercial costing templates and contracts, which every NHS organisation in the UK is obliged to use. And they were developed in conjunction with the pharmaceutical and life sciences industry. And they're used without modification. A lot of it, to and fro was happened with global companies with their American lawyers. Because American lawyers like to talk about things and spend money and you know what that can be like. But we've got to a situation where the contracts are now being used. It's taken about 5 or 6 years, but those contracts are being used without modification. And where they are used without modification, that means they can actually, the research can start much quicker. I'll say a little bit more about the local approvals and ethics in a minute, but the Clinical Research Network supports academics and life sciences companies to get through the system. And those are supported by model contracts and model agreements. And the network, it oversees the study management in conjunction with the sponsor or the contract research organisation. And this has been revolutionary. About 10 years ago, the recruitment to cancer studies, oncology studies in the UK, was about 2% of the UK population. We had an ambition to double that in 3 years. 10 years later, that now stands at 20% of the UK population with cancer participate in a clinical trial, and that's unparalleled anywhere else in the world. That's been a long journey to get there, but I admire your ambition to double, but don't stop there. Go further. So, how many patients do we involve in clinical research? Well, this is just the later phase multi-centre clinical trials in the UK that are supported by our Clinical Research Network. And you can see we are routinely averaging around 600 plus million patients a year. 600,000 patients a year going into clinical trials. And that's a good population going into clinical trials. We'd like to increase that. If you look at just commercial contract studies, so studies with the life sciences industry, these have increased year on year. And last year, the most current year we've got records for, the Clinical Research Network was involved in recruitment to 862 clinical trials. This is the largest amount that we've seen since we started collecting this data in 2008. Two things we've actually focused on, because we knew they were important to the life sciences industry, and also to academic research, was startup times and delivery. Our startup times in the UK used to be terrible. As was said in the debate, often the recruitment window for global trials would have closed before we could open sites in the UK. And that was a situation that had to be remedied. So we've focused over the last 10 years really on trying to work out how to reduce the speed and reduce the startup times and increase the speed of setup of clinical trials and ensure delivery. Part of that is getting the feasibility right in the first place, not doing it through guesswork, but using real data to get the feasibility right. And we focused on startup times. And now, from 5 years ago, when only 8% of our NHS sites could start up a trial, could approve a trial to be done in 40 days, that's now up to 83% of our sites to approve the trial to be ready to go in 40 days. So that's a huge increase over those years, but don't underestimate the amount of work that took to get to this point. So I'll say a little bit about ethics. In 2004, the system of ethics in the UK was, which sounds very similar to Poland, is we had lots of local ethics committees that looked at ethics at each site. And the timelines were very variable. Sometimes it took more than a year. From 2004, we put a single research ethics approval was introduced. They're still regional ethics, local ethics committees, but they give a single national opinion. So if a study comes into the National Research Ethics Service, it goes to the first available Research Ethics Committee that can look at that study. And that Research Ethics Committee, which is well trained, and I take the point about training is incredibly important, that study gives a single national opinion. There are specialist ethics committees for pediatric studies and ones that are more experienced in working in medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. But we have a local system coordinated nationally, and it works very well. So now, 95% of applications, a final decision was reached within 40 calendar days. And for those studies which are deemed low risk, which is greater than 90%, they receive a decision within 14 days. And that's routinely 14 days. So I think you see, if you can get the system right, you can make sure that ethics isn't the thing that slows down clinical research. I'm going to finish a little bit on patient data. It was mentioned a little bit earlier. And what I haven't got in my slides, but what I should say is a big piece of work that the National Institute for Health Research does is involving patients. We have a huge patient involvement program. And that's patient involvement right from the design and right from the prioritization of which research questions need to be asked in various therapeutic areas. And we work closely with the charity sector on that. In the design and conduct of studies, so many research studies funded by our organization have patients on the actual research team as part of the research team. And that's dramatically improved both the outcome measures and the protocol design of many studies. And also, we have a huge amount of input into actually encouraging patients to take part in clinical research. We have national campaigns. There's one called OK to Ask, which is encouraging people to ask their health professional if there's a clinical trial or clinical research that's suitable for them. And in our NHS, recently, it was 60 years old. they renewed the constitution for NHS, and in that constitution, it said every patient had the right to be a research patient if there was research that was suitable for them. So, and we're going through a big debate at the moment about the use of patient data. So we have 60 million people in one single healthcare system. We're having a very informed and slow and careful debate with the public about how best we use that data to support clinical research. And most patients will say, if you can't identify me, use it in any way you want. If you can identify me from that data, I want to control how it's used. And we're having a careful debate about that, how that works. But there's two areas where I think it's probably that are innovative in the UK. One is called the clinical actually, I'll look at the bottom one first. We have something called the NIHR Bioresource, which is a very innovative new resource that we have that has taken DNA samples from patients and along with the DNA sample and basic phenotypic information, the patients have given consent to be recalled for research based on their genotype. It has healthy volunteers. It has around 50,000 participants at the moment, and it's growing. It has healthy volunteers, and it has patient groups in cancer, cardiovascular disease, rare diseases, and others that are growing. And what it means is that academic researchers and commercial researchers, life science companies, can interrogate the data that's in the system, or they can ask for those patients to be recalled for research and recruited to clinical studies, for interventional studies. So very innovative. The Clinical Research Practice Data Link collects data from primary care, from our GP surgeries. And it's a longitudinal database that's been running for 25 years. It has 21 million patient lives over 25 years in that database, which covers 1.8 billion consultations with the healthcare system, and includes drug exposure, diagnosis and symptoms, referrals, laboratory tests, vaccination history, and demographic data. So an incredibly powerful database. It's got 600 GP practices currently contributing, and it supports both observational and is now beginning to support interventional research and real-world data studies. So in 2014 and 15 and last year, those 21 million patient lives supported the delivery of around 200 plus studies. So, drawing to a close, I was interested in the report that PwC did around barriers. We're now at the stage where, after 10 years, we're looking at impact. And we got RAND Europe to look at what was the impact of that investment over 10 years. And it was published at the meeting I was at last week. And it might be it's available on the NIHR website. It might be worth you having a look because it's got lots of case studies of how the system has changed and what it's delivered through that change to actually support both health and wealth. And just to finish off, I'll come back to my first question. Why does government, why would a government support health research? Well, I think the evidence is in the investment. The first group of bars is before our comprehensive spending review. And you can see when we've started to allocate the funding in a coordinated research system way, the government could see where that money was going and could see what impact it was making. And that increased. In the 2010 comprehensive spending review, again, which many government departments had flat cash, our budget increased. And then in the more recent comprehensive spending review last year, where funding was incredibly tight across government, and most government departments were asked to make a cut of 40%, we actually saw an increase to our health research budget. So I think you can see that it's important to make not only the health impact debate, but also to demonstrate that health research, good health research, can not only lead to health benefit, but can lead to economic benefit for the country. And therefore, the government has your ear and will invest in the system. So we'll end there, and I will thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Czy Państwo mają jakieś pytania do naszego gościa? Przetłumaczymy je. Myślę, że to są rozwiązania, z których tylko nasz rząd powinien czerpać. Na pewno prześlemy tę prezentację do pana ministra.
Yes, this is my question. I really want to thank you for that speech and for your presentation because it's really interesting. And in my opinion, it should be the first one today that everyone could see that it changed totally the point of view and all things that should be moved here. I mean, the topics which are really important. What I wanted to ask you is, I'm Victor Kroszla, I'm Magister of Public Health. I'm at this university. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think, if you have, of course, this information, about, for example, the market of employment in Poland, I mean nurses, because you mentioned in your presentation that many people as industry increased and changed. They got new jobs. What do you think about our Polish situation now, that how many people could get jobs and how it changed your market in UK?
It's interesting. I think 10 years ago, nursing in the UK was if you just take the nursing profession, was seen as a profession that didn't have the kudos that it used to have, and why would you go into it? We actually employ almost 8,000 nurses within the health service, and actually that's not only helped to stimulate that as a research, as a career pathway, but it's brought nursing in general up the scale. It's not just that. We support pharmacologists, statisticians, data managers. It's a whole career pathway. And I touched on our faculty that we support. It's often overlooked that we support training. Last year, the NIHR itself supported 25,000 people to go through GCP training. So it's an incredibly important part of creating a research workforce. And the government recognized, when we were looking at economic growth, we spoke to our Treasury about the definition of economic growth and how health supports economic growth. And they encouraged us to look at a very broad definition. So creating a research workforce, an expert research workforce in the UK, was seen as a huge boost to the economy. And actually, we have a lot of Polish workers, as you know, in the
yes,
UK,
of course.
who are supporting clinical research. So thank you for that. I think you have to look at a whole systems approach, because we need good clinicians coming through the system. In a previous job that I used to do, I was working on revolutionizing the medical training, and it was very difficult for doctors to loop out of the system to do clinical research. They had to do it in their spare time, or they had to take time off. We put an academic training program in for medics that allowed them to take time out to do research. And that, again, revolutionized the process.
Yes, and everything started from the move of government in 2005, yes? They created the special report. Three really important persons created this, yes? I mean, head of departments.
That's right.
And I have a question. How now it works with the changings which are coming from EU, not EU, sorry, EU to your country, that the law of EU is changing somehow your system?
I think we learnt from the last EU Clinical Trials Directive. So UK probably over-interpreted the last Clinical Trials Directive and put everything in place at one go. Whereas if you compare to France, they're probably still putting things in place from the last directive. So I think a lot of what we've already done, we're ready for the directive. I don't think it's going to alter a lot that we do. Our Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency, our regulatory body in the UK, works very hard within Europe, within the EMA, to make sure that we're already putting in place and anticipating what's going to happen. Who knows what comes from Europe?
Yes.
But we're not worried. We're not particularly worried about it.
And the last question, can you stay till Monday and join the breakfast with our minister? And maybe talk with him like 3 and 7 minutes, because you have the 7 minutes to tell all these solutions. But I think that you can give him your email address and then you can
Absolutely.
cooperate with him. Thank you
happy.
very much.
Well,
Czy jeszcze mają Państwo pytania?
Janusz Kabata, you mentioned the role of general practitioners in this system. Can you comment a little bit more on that? How did you bring them, to the research industry? I know it's not easy.
Well, in two ways, actually. And as we know, general practitioners are very time limited in the time they have to do research. So you have to make it easy for them. We've done it in two ways. One, as I mentioned at the end, around the use of data. So the clinical practice research data link puts the IT systems in place in general practice just to collect the data from GP surgeries who are willing to participate. Our clinical research network, actually, 10 years ago, was set up as a number of defined networks in disease areas. So we had a cancer network, we had a dementia network, we had a diabetes network, we had a mental health network, and we also had a primary care network. So it's a specific network set up in primary care with nurses who could actually go in and give time to GPs to recruit patients to those studies. We realized that we couldn't carry on setting up more and more networks. We needed a national system. So there aren't individual networks now, they're all part of one. But it's providing the infrastructure, people that can go and support those researchers to do research, GPs. The same goes for hospitals that are not used to doing research. So our big teaching hospitals in London have been doing research for years. We have a hospital in a place called Blackpool in the north of England. Never really done commercial clinical research. It's now one of our best recruiting sites because we can put trained nurses into that site to support the investigators to deliver clinical research. And the same goes for GPs.
Thank you very much. Proszę Państwa, nie widzę już osób, które chciałyby zadać pytania. Thank you very much.